Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another session of this year's Delphi Economic Forum. I'm Marianna Skylakaki, and I will be moderating our next discussion entitled Eco-Friendly Greece, Making Greece a Top Sustainable Tourism Destination. In the next 15 minutes or so, we will have the opportunity to talk about the benefits of a sustainable approach to tourism with a panel of experts at an important juncture for travel and tourism globally. In the aftermath of a devastating pandemic that has shown us just how interconnected Earth's ecosystem is, we are perhaps presented with a once in a lifetime opportunity to change how we do things for the benefit of our planet, our communities, but also to a large extent our livelihoods. An even larger number of people are realizing just how important sustainable living and traveling is, which could present a big opportunity from a business perspective as well, especially for a country like Greece. To discuss these important issues at this critical crossroads, I have the pleasure of welcoming Graham Miller, Professor of Sustainability in Business at the University of Surrey and chair of the Considerate Group, a specialist company that helps hospitality businesses operate responsibly. Mr. Randy Durband, CEO of the Global Sustainable Tourism Council, an organization that manages global standards for sustainable travel and tourism, acting as the accreditation body for sustainable tourism certification. Eleni Andreadis, Director of Sustainability at Sani-Ikos Resorts Group, whose Sani Resort in Chalkidiki was actually named the world's leading luxury green resort at the prestigious World Travel Awards for 2020. Eleni Andreadis is also a talented author and the founder of the non-profit organization Planet Agents, which aims to empower children to take action on environmental issues. Dr. Gregory Miller, an ecologist and thought leader in sustainable tourism and outdoor recreation, conservation of biodiversity and protected areas. Dr. Miller is the executive director of CREST, the Center of Responsible Travel in Washington, D.C. And last but certainly not least, Jeremy Sampson, the CEO of the Travel Foundation, an independent charity that works with tourism companies and organizations to unlock the positive potential of tourism, and who, along Dr. Gregory Miller, is also one of the co-founders of the Future of Tourism Coalition. Welcome to all of our esteemed speakers. It is a real pleasure to have you with us to share your valuable insights with the audience here at Delphi, at the Delphi Economic Forum this year. I'd like to start with a question to you, Professor Miller, that I hope will set the stage for the rest of our discussion. What is the value of sustainable tourism from a commercial standpoint, but also in terms of the efforts to reverse climate change from a big picture perspective?
Sure. So this question has been through a number, or quite a transition really, over the many years it's been asked. I do think we are now at a position where we have to say that companies can't afford not to be sustainable. I think we've looked at the moral argument, we've looked at the business argument, we've looked at lots of different arguments. And I think we just arrived now at the conclusion that companies can't afford not to be sustainable. We've seen that transition from companies that thought they would attract more luxury, higher spending customers, companies that wanted to save money through reducing waste, etc. We've always known that sustainable companies are less risky because they look more into their supply chain and they think about all the components of their business. So we've seen lots of evidence over the years that sustainable companies are less risky companies to invest in and to develop. I think now with social media, where we've reached a stage where any issue can become inflammatory and incendiary and can take off from nowhere, then unsustainable companies are at risk every day of attracting negative news stories if their practices are not good enough. And that's across a range of issues, not just climate change. And some of those issues may be issues that we don't even see on our radar. I was talking with a large UK supermarket a month or so ago, and they said that they didn't see the issue of plastics coming. And while that may seem a little bit incredible, I think some of these issues genuinely have caught large companies off guard. I think this absolutely goes for countries as well as companies. So I would include Greece in this. The work that we do through the Considerate Group, we see we look to save money for companies and to reduce their resource draw, energy, water and waste. Now, the amount of savings that we can make for companies depends on their starting point. Some of those savings come through the installation of technology, motion sensors to switch off lights. Some of them come through encouraging people to realise this is a pretty good way of switching off lights as well. And so those are behavioural changes as well as technological interventions. But it's not uncommon to see 15% reductions in the room energy costs through small level, minor level interventions. So I think, yes, there are important savings that we can make, but I would probably turn the question around a little bit and think about what the risk of not doing things is.
Well, I mean, if there's one takeaway that I hope people watching us will get to at the end of our conversation is that, you know, it's such an approach is good for business and obviously good for the planet and good for the environment. But it's important for us to really shed light on the ways that it's actually very good for business. And you mentioned just some of the ways just now. Thank you so much. My next question is to you, Mr. Durband. Do you see sustainability as an increasingly important factor in the traveling choices of tourists? And do you expect this trend to become more or less important in the aftermath of this pandemic?
Yeah, so for the first part of the question about before the pandemic, I think we've seen a trend in recent years, in the past 5 or 10 years, that there are more and more travelers that are focused on sustainability. I think factors there include over tourism was talked about a lot in mainstream media, got people thinking. I think more importantly, climate change has been talked about for decades, but I think more and more people around the world really see the impacts of climate change, not just in their backyard, but reading stories of increased frequency of typhoons and whatnot, and just more David Attenborough kind of documentaries and so forth. There's just greater awareness that climate change is quite upon us. And that brought in the flight shame movement that started in countries and was growing and spreading around the world before the pandemic. So yeah, I think that there is a 5 to 10 year trend where we're seeing more travelers conscious of it, but I think it's very uneven. It's going to be, perhaps more educated travelers, more well-read travelers that are kind of tuned into these issues. But I mean, I think broadly, all of societies see and feel the need to operate more sustainably in all of their lives, not just travel. But another caveat I would give is that not only is it not everyone, I think we have to be realistic and admit that the demand for sustainable travel is a bit tricky. At point of purchase, few people ask questions about how sustainable is this product or this service or this destination. And two interesting trends that run against that is that when they arrive at the hotel or arrive at the destination, they're increasingly concerned about sustainability. So on the one hand, some businesses think, well, nobody's really asking for it at time of purchase, but then they're slow to react to the fact that the traveler really is more concerned about it. And I think that's going to, I think they're going to become more vocal and more numerous in the coming years. So that'll become more obvious. And then finally, I would say that young people around the world, our organization operates globally and we talk to people all over the world. And I think it's fair to say that practically in any society, people under the age of 35 are very concerned. Now, the second part of the question, the pandemic, I think it's similar to part of my answer that some of the people, some of travelers are going to be much more in tune to issues of sustainability. I think many people had the opportunity in lockdown and just life slowing down for the past nearly 2 years to really reflect. Year and a half, I guess. It seems like forever, doesn't it? But to really reflect on life and what's important. And I think, we're seeing more and more people tuned in on sustainability issues. But yet, it's not going to be everybody. And there's going to be such a rush back to travel. People are so anxious to get out of the house and get moving again that who knows really how many of them will really tuned into these things. So I think the general trend is towards sustainability and greater awareness, and the pandemic has influenced that, but I think it'll be very uneven.
And what you're saying is so interesting, because there's a way perhaps to attract the sort of travelers that have that sort of eco consciousness, and it would be interesting to know what other characteristics these travelers have, and whether for a country like Greece it's particularly important to take advantage of this small lag that you mentioned between what our general understanding of what they need when they book a holiday, for example, is, compared to what they actually experience and what they value when they're at a specific destination. Thank you. I will come to Miss Andreadi, actually, because I'm really interested in hearing her perspective from the side of a hotel business, of a resort business. And I wanted to ask, from your experience as a hospitality group that has really focused on sustainability in recent years, what are some of the measures that you have found particularly effective? And could some of these be implemented by the average hotel in Greece? Because that's also a big issue. People watching us might think this just only affects a very specific subset of tourism businesses.
Thank you, Marianna. I think for us, so we've our programs, we officially started them 13 years ago. So our sustainability program is quite a mature program, and we've focused on 3 pillars. And the first is sustainable hotel operations. So setting very ambitious targets to do with well, we're carbon neutral, we're 100% renewable energy, certified for our electricity through our supplier, setting targets to do with becoming zero plastic, zero waste. One of our hotels is already zero waste. And having a 100-mile radius for 60% and more of our products. Our second pillar has to do with protecting local biodiversity, and the third is to do with helping local communities and supporting our people. So I mentioned these 3 as an indication of the breadth of things that someone needs to consider when looking at developing a sustainability program. And I don't think that it's something, I'm certain that it's not a scale issue. If anything, I think scale sometimes makes it hard to do a lot of things. So I would like to stress what people have already been talking about, the importance of this being a core part of the proposition for the business, be it a smaller or a medium or a bigger hotel. And I think what's really worked for us is the emphasis, I would say, on training and raising awareness. So, for example, talking to housekeeping about the Great Pacific Garbage Patch, when talking about why are we doing all this focusing on reducing plastic and recycling plastic so extensively, just creating that awareness. And it's taken some time, but I think especially, and this was referred to before, about how there's this great awareness amongst young people as well. So we're definitely seeing, we've created a culture over these years, and that's really important. And I would say that new and younger employees are specifically interested in this, because these are the people that will carry the program forward. And I would say also setting targets is extremely important. And for someone who is not so knowledgeable and doesn't have a big organization to have a sustainability department like we do, I would say that's where certifications, GSTC certified certifications that can really help in developing a program, setting those targets, be it around waste, understanding where you are, measuring, and then being able to improve, or water, and some, Mr. Miller also talked about some things that are very easy, like quick wins that you can install, like water, aerated filters, for example. You can see very, very quick, those are quick wins and quick ways to, that aren't a very big cost, which is, of course, a consideration at the moment because of tourism being in such challenging times. But it's not a trade-off, and it's not something sort of making money or being green. It's not that at all. It's about doing things differently.
We'll get more to these benefits of going green, but also what that can do to your branding. And I'm sure you can talk to us about that a little bit more as well. What's so interesting is this holistic approach that I think that you're all describing, that, it doesn't have to be just one thing. It has to be this big bucket of things, and working for quick wins that create the culture that encourage people, but at the same time setting very ambitious targets so that you get to a point where you're actually making quite an important difference. And I'd like to get to you, Dr. Miller, to ask a somewhat similar question. From your extensive experience covering these issues, can you speak to us about some of the bright examples and best practices that you have come across in the sustainable tourism space? If you could just point to a few that have really, really made an impact to you.
Thank you. And I want to kind of take a little different tack on that question, because I think it's so important as we look at the future to focus on the big picture of the pandemic and how it will impact various best practices. As we've seen, the pandemic will probably have little impact on the planet directly. I mean, we've seen reductions in pollution and greenhouse gas emissions. Some animals have returned to places that we haven't seen. But in terms of looking at the future, if there is any positive effect of this great pandemic pause in travel, I see it as our collective human perception of our impact and what we can and must do as a society to respond, adapt, and be resilient. Now, as we look at Greece and the world, and as travel resumes post-COVID, both within Greece and globally, we've seen several examples that indicate that we must have a significant and enduring change towards quality over quantity tourism. And we're seeing this happen across from the cruise industry, where a number of ports, whether it's Key West or there in Europe, are deciding to put the brakes on a just widespread or over tourism. And it's also the quality of visitation, not the quantity of visitors, that countries and destinations are starting to look at and really need to seek and measure. And with this, we are seeing now an individual and societal commitment to a responsible recovery. In the US, the US Travel Association recently identified destination stewardship as the top issue for tourism and a necessity to remain competitive. With a much more comprehensive definition of sustainability, and really what I think so many of us, all of us on this panel today, are talking about, a much more holistic approach to sustainability, where we can truly address the long-term economic, social, and environmental viability of a destination. At the Center for Responsible Travel, our perspective as we look across trends locally as well as globally, looking at a post-COVID environment, we're seeing from a variety of examples in the field that we anticipate that there will in fact be a profound shift in the competitive landscape in the travel and tourism sector, with several elements I want to just mention very important. One is preparation and effective risk management. Second area is adaptation and resilience. And decarbonization will be fundamental to future competitiveness and relevance. And what we are seeing now, both from the Center for Responsible Travel's perspective, as well as from Jeremy and our Future of Tourism Coalition, and I want to thank and recognize GSTC and Randy for the extraordinary assistance we've had there. We are truly taking a more holistic approach to looking at this, and it's extraordinary the number of destinations and businesses that are stepping up and looking to truly build back better. Thank you.
That is such an important and hopeful message, because we truly need to take this in a very tough, but there's this massive encouragement of this new focus. I think it's going to be really, really important. But before we move to our second round of questions, I have an important question for Mr. Sampson, because we've been talking about it about the sustainable tourism quite a bit already. I would like him to talk to us a bit more about the ecological footprint of a given trip, especially for people watching us who are not entirely sure just how damaging travel can be to the environment. And of course,
Sure.
your opinion as to whether this has become a more important consideration for travelers, which, from my understanding, it has.
Sure. Thanks, Mariana. And just to say, it's really great to be here with you and alongside these esteemed panelists. So thanks for the opportunity. So on the ecological footprint, it's great to have this question. I think just to zoom out for a moment and to think about the fact that the success of the tourism sector really depends on healthy ecosystems and destinations. So not only in relation to the product itself, great beaches and scenery or wildlife, but also for tourism's core operations. So things like clean water, effective waste management, healthy supply chains across food and beverage, healthy natural habitats for wildlife. So an ecological footprinting approach actually seeks to understand the amount of resource use that's demanded by tourism as an economic activity, and to identify the key drivers that actually drive up the use of resources, and ultimately identify where that demand can be reduced. And the goal is to really seek that, to ensure that we are not stretching resources beyond their capacity, which all too often we do end up in a situation where that's the case. We piloted an approach here in Greece, actually, a couple of years ago. I was involved in a project called Destimed. We were working in Crete in a protected area, and here we actually piloted an approach to measure the ecological footprint of an entire itinerary, and we did this across several countries. We were able to look at these itineraries and dig in and understand where the biggest drivers of the ecological footprint were coming from, and make concrete recommendations to the suppliers on where they could reduce because they were at risk of sort of demanding too much from the ecosystem. We assessed this across 4 areas: accommodation, transport, activity providers, and food and beverage. And we looked at things like procurement practices, overall sustainability practices, to understand how resources were being used. It was really interesting because our hypothesis would be that transport would actually be the highest demand for ecological footprint across those 4 areas, but food and beverage was the highest driver by far. It was quite significant, more than 50%. So we're able to make some concrete recommendations there around where food and beverage were being procured from, the quantities that were being procured, which in many cases were simply too much, and the sort of balance between meat and vegetables. And with being able to implement some of those recommendations, we found we were able to drive down the overall ecological footprint significantly when we retested. So really interesting to see how concrete it actually can get, and how by providing education and information to suppliers, we're able to help them really think through and understand what they were sort of demanding from the land, and how they could improve on that. The bit about travelers, I don't think travelers are yet asking at quite this detailed of a level, in terms of the ecological footprint, but they're definitely asking for more environmental responsibility, definitely wanting to understand impact on climate, and especially, as some of my other panelists have said, in younger generations. And ultimately, I think the other thing that's happening, and we are seeing this trend accelerate. It was already, I think, there before the pandemic, but accelerating even further, is the demand for more local products and experiences. And I think this is where a lot of that demand and consideration for travelers is, and will continue to put, I think, pressure on a positive way on the industry to improve. And ultimately, that's going to improve the ecological footprint as well.
I understand that it's also very connected to the actual experience of the traveler. That's why food is so important to this entire process. That perhaps that's a more interesting and more important part of the experience of traveling than, for example, how you turn switch a light on or off. So perhaps that's a way to get people to be more interested in these issues to start with. But I appreciate your response, because it really gave us a good understanding of how it is to really, really understand your process before trying to implement change in this respect. I'd like to come to you, Professor Miller, to get your view on how sustainability impacts a hotel brand and the benefits that tourism professionals can expect with respect to customer acquisition and loyalty. Perhaps Eleni Andreadis will talk to us a little bit about that as well. But I wanted to get your view on this.
Sure. I just take a second to come back to one of the other comments that was made about quality and quantity of tourists. I think it's really important. We're all involved in tourism because it's a wonderful thing that enriches us. It connects us to the rest of humanity and to the environment. So it's important. This is not just the preserve of an elite. We've got to have both quality and quantity. Sustainability is a problem of volume. So the volume's not going away. We've got to cope with the volume. From a climate change perspective, if we look at the way that the carbon emissions go into the atmosphere, it doesn't matter where on the planet they occur. It has the same effect at a planetary level. So if British tourists, all of them go to Spain or to Greece, and they're incredibly crammed in Spain and Greece. From a climate change, that's much better than them all flying to Thailand and being dispersed amongst small resorts across Thailand. Now, that has a negative impact on the resorts in Spain or Greece where they're squeezed into. And so we've got to manage tourism at a destination perspective for all the other aspects of sustainability. But from a climate change perspective, we do have to learn to cope with volume and accept that whether it's on cruise ships, whether it's in big mass tourism destinations, we've got to have quality and quantity. So, sorry, to come to your question about the benefits for hotel brands, one of the other big challenges that hotel brands and indeed all companies will increasingly face is the battle for talent. There's an incredibly small demographic of people coming through into the workforce. That's due to get only smaller. One of the other odd consequences of COVID is falling birth rates. And we see the fertility rates reducing across the world as well. So the battle for talent, young people coming into the tourism industry is a key challenge. I tell my students, I will not write a reference for you if you want to go and work for a bad company. And I abuse my privilege to determine what a good and a bad company is. And I will write a glowing reference for you if you go to work for a good company. And I take that to mean a company that's sustainable or not sustainable. So my students know that if they want me to write them a reference, they've got to go and work for companies that have got strong sustainability track records. I think the idea of Scope 3 emissions is an interesting one that's come into our awareness through climate change, whereby we become responsible for companies in our supply chain in terms of emissions. So their emissions become our responsibilities. But you can extend that idea from climate change out to a whole host of issues. And we've seen that with some of the sports shoe manufacturers that tried to distance themselves from the practices in the Bangladeshi sweatshops by saying, well, it's nothing to do with us, it's not our company, they're simply in our supply chain. And that's not protected them at all from negative attacks on social media. And in fact, that tactic of outsourcing their problems has only made the solution of those problems more difficult, because now actually they don't own the company, so they can't solve the problems because it's outsourced. So I think there's a number of benefits from a hotel brand of being more sustainable and beyond the obvious ones that we've spoken about before. But this battle for talent is going to become a really important one for companies to be aware of, and younger generations are just not going to work for companies that they seem to be in conflict with their identity. That's such an important element for younger generation coming through. An unsustainable company is not reconcilable with the identities of the generation coming through.
That's a truly, truly fascinating insight. And I did not expect that in your answer when I was writing down the question. But it's really, really important. Obviously, younger people seem to be a lot more interested in work, in combining what they believe in with the work they do. So it's a very powerful incentive, the one that you're giving them by not writing a recommendation unless they pick a truly, truly good company. But you also talked about volume, which sort of leads to my next question, which relates to Airbnb and this platform economy, because that's also a big part of tourism these days. We have seen the supply of travel accommodations explode in ways that perhaps make the imposition of sustainability standards even more difficult. So, Mr. Durband, that would be a question to you. How do you see this trend playing out?
Well, I think when you look at home sharing, Airbnb, that phenomenon, I think we have to kind of step back and look at the great grand history of tourism. We've had hotels for centuries, right? Smartphones for a few years. And when smartphones came out and gave us opportunities to book for ourselves, whether it's ride sharing or in this case, home sharing, you want to talk about accommodations, it's a very similar pattern where we had 100 years of cars to figure out how to license taxis. We had centuries to figure out how to tax hotels, how to regulate hotels. And then suddenly we have smartphones that changed the game just when global tourism demand was expanding greatly as the global middle class was growing with the growth of Asian economies, with the huge rebound we had in the economies and travel after the global financial crisis of 2008. And so we look at that as like, oh my God, we've managed so poorly. Yeah, we've managed poorly. I would argue that typically destinations have broadly been managed quite poorly. I'm not putting my finger at any one place in the world. I would just say across the board, there's not been enough in development at the destination level. That's changing very much, but we got caught up in this situation where all these conditions changed so rapidly and we had all these problems. There's not one Airbnb. Airbnb is different in every municipality. And municipalities around the world in the past years have changed some taxation regulation. They've changed rules for short-term rentals. They just didn't do it quickly enough. So we had citizens' protests in San Francisco and Barcelona and Amsterdam and here and there. So that really gained a lot of media attention because it was often in capital cities. I don't think we can blame a brand because if it wasn't Airbnb, it would have been their competitors. They moved aggressively to get market share, so we look at them. But it's the technology that allowed that, and the inability of municipalities to just quickly, like that, change regulations. And so that all gets better, as you do have short-term rental policies in place. And a forgotten piece of there are benefits from home sharing, less crowded urban areas and more remote areas, smaller places, smaller towns and cities that don't have as much capacity can have festivals and so forth. So it's a two-edged sword, but so there's good and there's bad. But I think the bad largely happened because it just happened so quickly, and destinations need to be managed more broadly. I go back to what my friend Professor Miller said about quantity. We don't want to necessarily fight against quantity. So much more could be done in visitor management and visitor dispersion and just management issues in general to manage for quantity. So again, it caught us all by surprise in the last years at the phenomenal growth. So the lesson is governments, public sector, need to move faster, not to regulate, but to plan, have incentives, have programs for dealing with the generally increased demand. And demand will come back, of course, after the pandemic.
Well, the good thing is that at least in Europe, there seems to be a big wave of funding that is coming in the way of businesses to try and transform the way they do things post pandemic in that direction. Hopefully, there will be innovative ways to take advantage of that. But I'd like to stay on this topic of quantity and over tourism and this explosion of the Airbnb economy, because it's a big trend in Greece as well, especially for some of the most popular travel destinations in the country, like Santorini, for example, has become a very good example of that globally. And I'd like to get to you, Dr. Miller, and get your view on whether this can be tackled by entrepreneurs. My understanding from what Mr. Durband also said is that this is not something that business can just solve on its own. You need the assistance of authorities in order to move forward in a sustainable way. Is that correct?
Yes, let me build on Randy's good comments. At CREST, we have focused for quite some time on the issue of over-tourism. In fact, I will make a shameless plug for our new book on over-tourism, which will be coming out on May 27th. And one of the things that I think is so important to look at this question of volume is to look at what are the acceptable limits of change in volume, whether it's of people or any other resource or any other input, I should say, because tourism is in fact an input. Now, pre-pandemic, over tourism was top of mind. I think in the latter part of 2019, I think all of us were focusing on the tremendous flow of visitors into certain places. And it was, in fact, considered by many a mega threat to sustainability of destinations and livelihoods. What we're seeing now and what we've found, we've taken a look over the last year at about 31 case studies of over-tourism globally, looking at a broad array of destinations and tourism models, that a central lesson we've found from the pandemic, as from over-tourism, is the critical importance of good government and destination governance. There's just no way business itself is going to work itself out and find all the solutions to over tourism. It is essential, and let me just underscore what has just been mentioned, that we have a commitment to long-term planning, effective management, and centering the future of tourism around destinations and communities for that sustainable future. So what we're seeing and looking at over tourism impacts across the Americas, Europe, Asia, at a grand scale as well as locally, where we have found that the destinations that have been doing the best, both pre-pandemic and we anticipate them being most competitive in a post-pandemic environment, are those that have shown early, aggressive, and consistent policies grounded in good science, that have clear and informative public messaging, have genuine civic engagement, have good public health systems, and boy, have we seen this with the pandemic as a global stress on society, and effective government leadership. And what we're talking about, and there is a very interesting thread here in our conversation on the panel today, when you look at over tourism or the management of visitor volume, the fact is high volume can be managed and over tourism can be avoided. The pandemic really brought to light that the problem is not too many tourists, but how to manage tourism in a way that maximizes sustainable benefits for people, the planet, and destinations. It's really that three-legged stool that we want to see be strong and viable. So what we want to undertake is that governments, tourism businesses, destination management organizations, nonprofits, and others have in fact put good tools to work to solve this issue. And these solutions really deal with a number of key elements or inputs to sustainability, and that's transportation, ticketing, creative use of technology, dispersal and diversification of the visitors, and strengthening responsible tourism and visitor education. We've taken a good look, and several of us on the panel obviously have focused on the tremendous importance of tourism for Greece. And ultimately, it would seem to me that Greek destinations must really proactively manage tourism moving forward in the following way. First is that sustainable tourism must come from more holistic strategic planning with stakeholder involvement, good management, and active monitoring of tourism's impacts. In Greece and elsewhere, we need to look at tourism with the same rigor as other sectors that both help and harm our well-loved places. And finally, we must transform the way we travel for these Greek destinations, their landscapes, their historic sites, their wildlife, and their cultures for these destinations to survive. And I think we're in a very interesting nexus point in society with coming out of hopefully coming out of the pandemic to getting much more to a robust global tourism environment. It's very important that we take this more holistic approach. And I applaud the efforts to date that have been made in Greece. Greece can continue to actually investing in this kind of approach and be a true leader globally in sustainable tourism. Thanks.
Thank you. That really is our hope, and I truly believe that the insights that a lot of the stakeholders who are watching us, because Delphi Economic Forum does have lots of different stakeholders, policymakers, entrepreneurs, business leaders,
Exactly.
are really taking in all of these important insights. Thank you so much. Now, I'll get to Miss Andreadis again. Eleni, you recently commissioned an important research report on the topic of our panel today, which we have been implementing together over the past few months. Why did you decide to take on the role of educating the Greek travel industry and the wider public on the importance and potential of establishing Greece as a sustainable tourism destination?
Yes, I mentioned before how much we believe in awareness raising and training and education that we've focused on a lot, certainly internally. And we partnered with Athenea and Marianna, your team, that has a track record in highlighting issues that need to become mainstream in Greece, and this is certainly one of those. And what we've tried to do is to see what we can learn from best practice around the planet from all sorts of different countries, and what we can identify and what we can use here. And the full study is going to be released in September, and we'll be working hard on disseminating that knowledge across the industry. But what I can say is that we're seeing a lot of the leaders in these areas really doubling down on their efforts on these issues, and specifically also on decarbonization, but across the board really, and making it a part of their proposition. And I think what's interesting is to see how we can apply these issues in Greece. And there's a lot that we can learn from, and a lot that we can apply in moving forward this discussion. And I think it was mentioned before also that really a lot of things are aligning, at least in Europe. We're seeing with the Green Deal and the incentives that are coming through, that we can really, there's coming back to Professor Miller's point, there really is no other way to be going forward. And we're going to be seeing this, we're already seeing this with banks asking for KPIs, being able to get better access to lending, the branding issues that we mentioned. We're certainly seeing our HR efforts in recruiting people focus a lot on our sustainability initiatives, because younger people do want to be very proud of where they work for. They don't just expect you to be doing these things. They expect you to be a positive force within your community, and that's what they're looking at. So, and of course, as we said before, guests being much more discerning at different degrees. I would agree with that, different degrees, but certainly we are seeing from our guests a lot of interest in the programs. We're seeing a lot of feedback on all the different social media, on TripAdvisor, comments that really are quite at quite a high level. So really, we see engagement in these issues. So I think all these things are extremely important, and we're very happy to be part of this conversation, and hopefully help in disseminating such knowledge that can be useful to all of us.
We're really excited about this project, and hopefully we'll get a chance to present more in the coming months. But I just wanted to say that it really is there's this important timing issue here that yes, we don't have a choice, and I think a lot of people are realizing that we don't have a choice from our planet's perspective. We don't have a choice in terms of the funding that is coming our way. We need to change our ways because the European Green Deal is really focused on these issues. But we have an opportunity here to be proactive and to really benefit as a country, for example, as an industry, from this trend. And I think it's really important to get this point across, that there is this very good timing right now to do all of these things. I think we have time for just one more question from Mr. Sampson, and it's going to be a bit more of a global question. Climate change is a crisis that is finally getting more coverage from mainstream media. It is becoming a key theme in conferences such as the Delphi Economic Forum. How can we reframe this discussion so that this crisis can be seen as an opportunity for sectors such as tourism? We've touched upon it, but I'd really like you to close our conversation today with more insight.
Sure. If you don't mind, I want to very quickly address the quantity versus quality debate, because I can't possibly have that party pass without making a comment, but it will tie into my bigger picture perspective. I think that this, to close that conversation, just to add one bit of perspective, this search for quality tourists and this change from quantity to quality that has been in the lexicon now for a bit. In that case, quality really is conflated, I think, too often with just higher spending tourists. And I think it's really unwise to dismiss particular market segments as inherently undesirable. A few of my other colleagues have said this. And we've done some research which shows that it simply is not the case that higher spenders are always better for a destination. And in particular, sometimes they bring with them the highest environmental costs, including in terms of their own emissions. So we really need a much more nuanced understanding of value. And I suggest, instead of quality tourists, there is a need for really looking at quality tourism. And when it comes to the conversation around climate, first of all, I just want to say that before we reframe the discussion so that we see it as an opportunity, I think it's important to acknowledge that it's a good thing if tourism is really coming to the table now, to be more transparent about its role in the climate emergency. There's a big focus now on how do we decarbonize, how do we reduce emissions. We're working very closely with another initiative that's emerged in the last year and a half, which is called Tourism Declares a Climate Emergency, bringing together destinations, tour operators, accommodations to work together towards decreasing emissions in a way that aligns with the science. So by 55% in the next 10 years, which is what the science is telling us that needs to happen. The COP26 is happening this year in Glasgow, and the tourism sector will have its largest presence ever there. So it's a time where the tourism sector is coming together to be more transparent, to respond to the crisis, and to take responsibility. And you've also mentioned already things like the EU Green Deal, which calls for decarbonizing the European economy. And I'm not sure how we do that without taking a hard look at decarbonizing the tourism economy alongside it. But on the other hand, this is about transitioning to a low carbon tourism economy. And I think there is plenty of opportunity there. So first, for tourism to lead, to really show the catalytic power of the tourism value chain and the role that it plays in the global economy by taking real leadership on this issue and showing how changes in the sector will have a genuine ripple effect. And this will be really good, I think, for keeping tourism on the political agenda after the pandemic, where we've really seen the detrimental effects of sort of life without tourism in particular communities. So this opportunity to really demonstrate tourism as a force for good, which is a phrase that gets thrown around a lot, but if we can genuinely demonstrate how making this shift to a low carbon tourism economy will have that ripple effect globally, I think that would be a tremendously positive thing for the tourism sector. But also, in just thinking about what a low carbon economy looks like, it's a real chance to accelerate our response to all these other emerging trends and desire for local, low impact, less harmful, and better for communities product, so product and services. And ultimately, I think those kinds of products, making sure that those are front and center in our communities and in the tourism sector, will create more equitable economic opportunities. So when you really look at the big discussions that are happening globally, you have the climate emergency, you have the pandemic exposing inequities, and then you have the conversation around diversity, equity, and inclusion. And this is the opportunity to really transform tourism into the sector that will lead and be a solution in all of those areas.
Thank you, Mr. Sampson, and I hope that our entire discussion today was a way of showing how tourism can be a force for good and particularly helpful in transforming the global economy in this new world that we're living in. Thank you all for your valuable insights. I think they're coming at a very, very important time for Greece. Greece is just opening up its tourism sector after a long time due to the pandemic, and we're hoping it's gonna be a good season. But I think these are important points to keep in mind for the entire year and for entrepreneurs to really take account of in their planning. Thank you all so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.